Love staying informed? Subscribe now and get unlimited access to local news, weather, and sports for just 99 cents a month for your first 3 months at inforum.news/join. Read every story, listen to every podcast, and download the apps that keep you informed and on the go 24 hours a day. So head to inforum.news/join right now to subscribe. What are you waiting for? Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month at inforum.news/join.
Welcome to Plain Talk, and we just completed a legislative session, a very consequential legislative session. Although I have a column up today that maybe the session's not entirely over yet. There was a small bill drafting error related to pensions. It's super down in the weeds, but anyway, we're going to get to that in the second part of the show. House Minority Leader Josh Boschee will be joining us. But before we do that, we're going to talk with our Attorney General, Drew Wrigley. Drew, how you doing? Welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to have a chance to talk with you and your listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the first question I wanted to ask is, there's been a lot of, obviously I've been very critical of this legislature about focus on, I guess, what I have described as culture war bills. I thought they just spent too much time doing it. That's a matter of taste. Other people look at that and say, great, that's exactly what I want them doing. And my question for you is, some of these are going to end up getting challenged in court. Obviously, the abortion bill, it was already being litigated, the trigger bill. Now the legislature has amended the law, so I'm assuming that's got, obviously has implications for litigation. But going forward, I have a feeling that some of these bills are going to be challenged. None have, to my knowledge, yet. But, and I know that you probably don't want to comment on the legal arguments, but one thing that you requested for your office was more staff. And one thing that you and I have talked about is wanting to bring more of that litigation in-house instead of the state of North Dakota hiring outside counsel. So can you speak to that a little bit about what that change means for our costs and our state's role or how we handle litigation stemming from some of these bills?
Sure. There's a lot of questions in there. I'll try to address them. We thought, and the legislature gave us some additional attorneys for our civil litigation division, and we will be able to show without any difficulty how we will be saving the state of North Dakota money. We will also be making our civil litigation processes more seamless, more efficient, and we really believe that's the vision going forward. And we'll be able to quantify those savings pretty quickly, and we won't be able to hire those people until after July, but we're already making decisions here that are clipping back some of the outside litigation that gets done, and we've recently filed a really very significant federal lawsuit along with 23 other states in the waters of the U.S. We did that with our attorneys and with the state attorneys from the other states that we're joining in. We didn't hire outside counsel as has been done in the past. And on one motion that we were successful on, gaining a federal injunctive relief in 24 states, a very, very significant matter nationally, pushing back against the Biden administration, we saved $100,000 in a month and a half of legal fees. So we're making decisions like that right now. We'll be able to make more and more of those as we bring those litigators on, and we'll be able to quantify it in 2 years for the legislature. So that's our commitment on that front. But to the issue, when you say culture wars, I'm gonna cut out of that, if I could, the 2150, which was the new abortion prohibitions and the new law that was passed and signed into law here in the wake of the Dobbs decision, but then also the decision by the North Dakota Supreme Court, creating for the first time, I would argue, out of thin air, the idea that there's certain bars to certain kinds of legislation here in North Dakota. So that legislation came through. It's going to have to be litigated. And I don't think
can I interrupt you?
You're talking about a matter of life and death.
Let me jump in there though. What are you talking about? Bars for our listeners, if they're not familiar with that. Bars with the legislation.
Well, they just said that I didn't think everybody expected it. There's nothing in law that does or should require one human being to give up their life for another. That's not required anywhere in our law. And everyone understands that there's got to be a life of the mother exception for abortion prohibitions. You have to have a life of the mother exception. And North Dakota, the legislature in the past had passed a life of the mother exception, except that it was an affirmative defense as opposed to an exception. And so they moved that into the exception side, the life of the mother. What came out of the Supreme Court here in North Dakota recently was a general, completely undefined, and I would say, I still can't find that in the Constitution. Most lawyers that I know can't, but it's now been ruled that there's a health exception. It's a general health exception also is required. And it's not defined at all. So now the legislature took it upon themselves, and they have to define, well, what are the bounds of that? So now there's an exception for the prohibition on abortion in North Dakota. There's an exception for life of the mother and the health of the mother as defined in this legislation. And I'm not going to go beyond this discussion because we expect this to be a matter of litigation. But now this is what's been served up. Now we have this session, and hopefully it's taken care of here, but if not, there'll be successive sessions where we have to define what are the contours of the life of the mother exception. And those are matters that I think the legislature is uniquely qualified to draw the lines. People they get elected to come out here and make these decisions, and it's our job to defend their work in this regard, and we'll be doing that.
General Wrigley, you've had, this is your first session as Attorney General, certainly not your first experience with the North Dakota State Legislature, having served as the Lieutenant Governor and therefore President of the Senate. You're very familiar with the goings-on before you became Attorney General. What, in your opinion, is the role of the Attorney General when it comes to either advising or, I hesitate to use the word lobbying, but testifying for or against bills that you feel may result in a lawsuit for the state that will evoke a cost, no matter how you slice it, whether it's streamlined within your office or with outside counsel?
I appreciate that question. It's a very good one because and there are legislators that will come in, and some days they ask us for analysis along the lines of, is the light switch on or is the light switch off? So to say blankly, is this constitutional? And it doesn't work that way. We're not in a position to. Sometimes there are obvious prohibitions on things constitutionally. Other times our advice might be, this looks to us like it might be constitutionally problematic. But the legislature has not only the right in our system; it's built this way. If they choose to, if they can get a majority of them to do it and get signed into law by the governor, sometimes push the bounds and find out where those lines really are. So we do the best we can to let them know if it is a black and white issue. It's obvious to us. We let them know if we think that there are challenges, there'll be a legal challenge of some kind. That's not the end of the analysis, but it is our job to make them aware that we expect litigation as a result of this piece of legislation or that piece, so that they can factor that in. I absolutely. I never want to be out there looking like we're trying to rattle a saber, trying to form their judgments for them. We just want them to have that information so they can build it in.
I think sometimes that's really good, and I can't imagine that's easy because it's got to be really subjective. Sometimes like my feelings about when it's appropriate to push the boundaries are going to be different than Ben's, and so the cost analysis. There's a very well defined process of creating fiscal notes for legislation where we go through and we say, well, if we expand this, it's going to bring in this much additional revenue, or it's going to cost us this much additional money. It's a way of trying to inform lawmakers. This is the price tag if you try to do this, or this is the additional revenue that it'll bring in, whatever the case may be. Is there a formalized process for notifying the legislature saying, listen, there's a significant litigation risk? Should we have a formalized process if we didn't already?
I don't know that there's a way to meaningfully know what it's going to cost to litigate. We can give an estimate. We can give an estimate of what we think, but we don't know, for instance, whether injunctive relief would be forthcoming from a court, which then we would make. Perhaps we would appeal it. Perhaps we would not. Is it a matter that it's going to end up in federal court? Is it a matter that if it goes to federal district court, would we want to push that, have the ability to push it on to the circuit court if the state of North Dakota did not prevail? There's so many unknown factors, but just the idea itself that whether we would expect there to be litigation is something we need to inform, and we do inform the legislature about. And then they can weigh that. We live in a litigious society. That's the other thing. The initiative of a legislature can't always be curbed because someone thinks there might be a trial or a case or a filing of some kind. I've been in and out of courtrooms for 3 decades, and as a prosecutor, for instance, I made my decisions and going forward on charging, and then what plea offers to make or not make. I personally didn't like to factor in for myself and my caseload or the people that worked for me when I was the United States Attorney. I don't want them factoring some fear of litigation. That's what we're here to do when necessary. If you can avoid it, you want to avoid it. But if you can't, and then you go to trial. Then you seek the injunctive relief. Then you push back against people filing suits against you. That's our job, and I stress that to my colleagues here all the time. That we're not litigious for the fun of it, but where we're necessary to represent the interests of the people of North Dakota, and that includes the enactments of the people that they sent out here to make the law. We're prepared to do that.
Attorney General Wrigley, we had some contention this session with the legislature and some of the legislation that you were proposing or backing specific to Senate Bill 2107. I wanted to give you a chance to respond to that, but I wanted to tee you up first. Specifically, Representative Landon, I hope it's pronounced Bahl. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, from Grand Forks. He was after my time, so I don't know him. But he stated in the process of let's just summarize and call it moving the bill from chamber to chamber and into conference committee, that you had, quote, knocked Wrigley, this is according to the Grand Forks Herald, knocked Wrigley for overstepping his role and now appearing to be making policy and having heavy and unfair influence within our legislative body on the bill. And secondly, there's criticism of how the bill was handled from House Judiciary Chair Representative Larry Clemeen, from Judiciary Committee member Representative Shannon Roers Jones. You had stated, I believe it was in the forum, but it was somewhere, you had stated that she was not I believe it was a criminal, and I'm not a lawyer and it's showing, but criminal prosecuting attorney like you, she was a civil attorney. I will give you my unasked for 2 cents. I felt like that was a swipe at her, almost a personal one, and I didn't quite understand why that was part of the discussion. But I wanted to hear from you if you thought that was a personal swipe and what you were hoping to get as a result from those, and your thoughts on Representative Bahl's comments on your interaction with the legislature.
That wasn't a personal swipe at Shannon at all. We're well acquainted. I've known her many years. No, it wasn't personal. It was factual. She doesn't have background experience in criminal law, and that doesn't delegitimize her view as a legislator. But it does raise an issue that there were a couple of one in particular, a state's attorney who was testifying and constantly saying things like the state's attorneys think the following, the state's attorneys don't believe the following. And I felt really strongly about the fact that I've spoken to so many state's attorneys and assistant state's attorneys around the state. Plus, I've got 30 years in and out of criminal prosecution work. I feel well positioned to discuss these issues. And, we had 36 senators vote in favor of this legislation. It was 36-11. It passed overwhelmingly in the state Senate. And we were led to believe, and we do believe, we had a majority of support in the House. But a handful of members of the House Judiciary Committee derailed our legislation in a hearing room, and they completely gutted it. And that was led by Shannon Roers Jones, and didn't bother to come and talk to me about the legislation. Never raised it with me, not a single time. Not one syllable did she come down and talk about it. And one would think, with the overwhelming support that we had out there, and the chiefs of police and the sheriff's association and the peace officers all across the state of North Dakota, that they would do that, but they didn't. And she was being advised by, I don't know, whomever, but didn't bother to come down here and talk to us. So now I'm going to talk about that stuff publicly. I think that's my job. Brandon, I don't even know him. We've never had a conversation. He's new here, and it showed in his comments, including his comments about Larry Clemeen, the longtime legislator and chairman of his committee, but that's okay. I mean, if that's the way he wants to conduct himself, he can do it, I guess. But he didn't. He didn't bother to get his speech factual, but he did give a full-throated speech that day on the floor of the House. And either way, what happened then it gets derailed, and it goes back to the committee. They sent it back to the committee without getting a vote. It never got its day in court in the House. I was led to believe by some senior House members that it had majority support there to match with the majority support in the Senate. And let's remind your listeners what we were talking about. This had protections in it for law enforcement, who too often has to deal with people who resist arrest, assault the officers, and flee, endangering our communities. And it had enhanced penalties for people who commit violent felonies. It only applied to violent felonies being committed with firearms. And that's what they gutted out of this. And it also had truth in sentencing, that if you get sentenced for fleeing from police, or if you get sentenced for using a firearm, committing a violent offense in North Dakota, then you have to serve 85% of it. It's truth in sentencing. They gutted that out of there. I mean, these are the things this is why this was very popular legislation. The public, I've been talking about this for 18 months around the state of North Dakota. The public is very supportive of this narrowly focused anti-violent crime, because they realize all across North Dakota, violent crimes going up, violent crimes with firearms particularly going up. And they're tired of it, and they want to see people actually serve the sentences. They want lengthier sentences, and they want people to have to serve it. Simple.
So, Drew,
we got derailed, and we're going to come back.
One of the things I heard from both sides, because it was said during the floor debates when Representative Bahl and others, would stand up on the House floor, they said that you weren't communicating with them. You're saying that, or at least Shannon Roers Jones wasn't communicating with you.
Yeah.
Is there a way to, during the interim, before we have another legislative session, you're obviously still committed to this issue. You're going to be talking about it, and rightfully so. I mean, I think there is a real problem underneath all this that could possibly be addressed by public policy. So I guess the answer is what steps are you prepared to take to try to find some common ground with the people in the legislature opposed to you?
Yeah, we worked with all sorts of people. This came in as a mandatory minimum bill. I proposed it as a mandatory minimum, and we made common ground movements with the Senate and made it presumptively mandatory. It was no longer mandatory at all. It was just a presumption that it'd be mandatory, and then if it wasn't, then the court would have to explain why not. So, I mean, we made great strides with a number of people. One of the people who stood up on the floor of the House, this was actually comical. I mean, it stood up on the floor of the House, accused me of not collaborating, not talking. This was a person who I had spoken to about this legislation many months in advance.
Let's name the person. If we're going to talk about, let's name the person.
Representative Satrom.
Okay.
And so I've spoken many months before to a large group of legislators, bipartisan, with law enforcement present in Jamestown. I spoke about this legislation, not a peep. I didn't hear word. All support, by the way. The people in uniform wildly support this legislation, and with good reason. So then I pre-filed the bill. I spoke at a Lincoln Day dinner 1.5 feet away from that representative. I spoke all about this legislation. I talked about it that night. He and I met for an hour and 45 minutes over breakfast in Jamestown 5 days before he took the floor of the House and said that I didn't collaborate with him or whoever else he wanted me to collaborate with, I guess. I've got all sorts of documented evidence where the guy, I have met with all sorts of people, and he not one time did Representative Bernie did not one time, including that 1 hour and 45-minute breakfast one-on-one, just him and me. Not once did he raise an objection to it. Not one time did he say, Drew, I really wish you'd change it in the following ways. Now, isn't that odd? You stand up on the floor of the House and you say those things? That's slanderous. I don't know what else to say about it. So now I am a passionate person about this work. And I know that I'm carrying forward a proposal that I truly believe in, but more importantly, men and women in uniform, the people of the state of North Dakota, the Peace Officers Association, the vast majority of state senators, and I'm told even the majority of the House members, they never got to vote on it, support this. And so here we are. We'll continue to work with people, but I will not
General Wrigley,
pretend.
yeah. Attorney General Wrigley,
No, I'm not going to pretend that those are that opposition. Now that means those are people that I need to work harder to collaborate with. Everything I just detailed for your listeners, I know that can be a little boring, but my gosh, you don't get to stand up on the House and then go unchallenged. When you say something like he hasn't collaborated, and I can document for you, I mean, hours and hours of opportunities, and you don't say a word to me? Come on.
Attorney General, well, you should know, Attorney General Wrigley, the boring processes of public policy making is kind of the premise of their show.
Yeah.
I did want to mention, you had just mentioned presumptive mandatory minimums. And when we had Representative Roers Jones on the show, she had mentioned that she did not know of another state that had that. And I would add, one, I hadn't heard of it, but again, I'm not an attorney and I'm not a criminal defense attorney. But two, when I was in the legislature, I noted when we were the first state to do XYZ thing, that was usually it got a lot of attention at the very least, and there's usually a lot of opposition to it. Can you speak to this being a unique? I don't really understand what it is, to be very honest with you. And I'm sorry because the clock's got us, but I think it's very important for our listeners to know.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. We're proud of it. We're proud of this. It's cutting edge. It's cutting edge because what it says is it's built into the law. It's defined in our statute. It's presumed. I'll give you the example from this legislation that if you commit a violent criminal act, a violent crime in North Dakota, and you use a firearm, you have stepped up presumptions of a sentence. For instance, if you are, and it's consecutive. So if let's say the defendant committed a burglary. And they brought a firearm with them. They possessed a firearm when they were burglarizing this house. And it's shoved in their waistband. They have it in case they quote unquote need it. The presumption under our legislation would have been they get sentenced on the burglary to X number of, let's say they get 4 years, whatever the judge wants to give them. And then it's presumed that because they possessed a firearm, making it a much more dangerous offense, they get an additional 3 years tacked on to the end of the sentence. If they brandish the weapon, if they pulled it out, let's say they pull it out because they get confronted by the homeowner. They pull it out, they don't shoot it, but they pull it out and brandish it, it's presumed they get an additional 5 years of incarceration. And if they discharge the weapon, they shoot it, they fire it intentionally during the criminal act, the violent criminal act, they get 7 years. So it's stepped up conduct, but it's presumed, it's not mandatory. It's presumed that if the judge doesn't do that, she or he would have to, under our legislation, they would have to write in as part of the sentencing order, write in there, why not? Why did you not give an additional enhanced sentence for the use of a firearm in committing that violent offense? And then you'd have to serve 85%. Those are the things that the opponents of this legislation gutted it first, then we got it back into the legislation, and then they derailed it so it wouldn't get voted on in the House. Now, those presumptions, what's innovative about it is, again, it wipes out the argument that this takes away the court's discretion. It does no such thing. It doesn't mandate the sentence, but it sends a signal from our policymakers. We presume that you will give additional and lengthy sentences that are going to be served 85% at least if they get good time. And if you don't do that, you have to explain to the public why. It's transparency, it's accountability, it's truth in sentencing, and it's dealing with violent criminals to make sure that they're getting appropriate sentences and then serving them.
Well, Drew, you gave us.
It's innovative, and I think it's an idea that'll get. And we got to that presumption after the Senate sent the signal they didn't want to have it be this go around and be mandatory. So we relented, and we actually had a good collaborative piece of work put together, and it got overwhelming support in the Senate across the hall. The rest is history.
Well, Drew, I appreciate you coming on. You gave us till 10:30. We took till 10:30, so I appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to this debate continuing on.
Thanks. We are too. And if your listeners, if people are interested in talking to me about this, I get once in a while, we'll get an email here or a call. I'll talk with the citizens, anybody who wants to chat about this. I'm glad to do that because it's an important matter. And we really, like I say, we got the overwhelming support in the Senate. I was told we were going to pass in the House too, but it got derailed before it got its day in court. And my way of thinking is we have to make sure it gets back in front of the legislature next go around, and we get that up or down vote.
Well, Drew, thanks. Appreciate it.
Hi there. My name is James Wallner. I produce and host the podcast Dakota Spotlight, a true crime podcast that tackles historical and unsolved crimes in the upper Midwest. Follow along with me as we search for a missing girl, attempt to solve a 45-year-old murder, and much, much more. That's Dakota Spotlight Podcast, anywhere you get your podcasts, or at inforum.com/podcasts.
Well, we just finished up our interview with Attorney General Drew Wrigley, and that's certainly an interesting thing. Talked with him a little bit about the litigation aspect. I can understand what a touchy place that puts the Attorney General in, Ben, in that you can't really do like I guess what I was talking about, like sort of like a legal fiscal note where you're warning about the potential for litigation because it's so uncertain. You can't really put a price tag on litigation because you have no idea how long it's really going to take. No. It could get dismissed immediately. It could go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. You don't really know. Also, any idiot with $25 can file or whatever the filing fee is these days, can file a lawsuit. So I don't know. I mean, that's hard, but I do think it's something that the Attorney General should be active on, advising the legislature that there's the risk for litigation, and maybe people
his approach is a departure from his predecessors. He specifically kind of took a stance that states are laboratories of democracy. Push it. It was his literal words were push the constitutionality. I felt like Attorney General Wayne Stengen was a little bit more active about advising when he thought something was unconstitutional. Maybe he would have disagreed with me, and maybe others who had more experience
also,
there would.
What is and is not constitutional sometimes in the eye of the beholder too, as we've learned.
Well, it's anyone who disagrees with me. We've established that.
It is unconstitutional for you to disagree with me, Ben. Let's be honest. That's how some people view it. All right, we got enough horsing around. We got serious business to get to. That's why we brought the House Minority Leader. Well, former House Minority Leader, Josh. I wanted to ask you about that, first of all.
Hung up his spurs.
Why right at the end of the session... for people who weren't following, right at the end of the session, maybe this kind of got overshadowed by some of the other stuff going on. Democrats made a change in their leadership in the House. Zach Ista moved up. He is the House Minority Leader now. Josh stepping down after, how long were you there? 8 years as a minority?
Yeah, 3 sessions as the Minority Leader.
Okay, yes. 3. Yeah, so why the timing? Because usually that happens at the beginning of a new session. Why at the end of this session?
Right. No. I was one of the 4 returning caucus leaders, right? So we had 3 other new leaders leading the caucus. And so they got their training wheels during session. And what I suggested to our caucus was, let's make a shift now so that whoever they choose, who ended up being Representative Ista, has the opportunity to use the interim to build a relationship with those 3 other leaders. And they can be the team that I felt Joan Heckerman, Rich Wardner and Chet Pollard and I were during those 2 sessions. We worked together. So it really was about making sure that relationships are getting built during the interim. Hopefully then Representative Ista is elected as the caucus leader in the next session. I'm up for re-election. He's not. So it just provides some of that continuity and allows those relationships to be built.
Are you going to run for re-election?
You should never ask him at the end of a horrible legislative session like we just experienced.
You shouldn't ask him at the end of a really good legislative session either. Everybody's tired.
Yes. I have every intention of running at this point, but we'll see how things pan out over the next year.
Representative Boschee, you have been there for, what is this, your 6th session?
I always forget the number of sessions, but 10th year. I was elected in 2012.
Yes, 10th year. A few of them you had the misfortune of being stuck next to me. Rank this legislative session of all the sessions you've had so far. Would you put it towards the bottom? Do you have a number?
Absolutely towards the bottom. Probably into the basement.
Into the basement. And was there because I do worry about when there are things I read today that there was a 2-year tuition freeze on North Dakota higher ed institutions. I didn't even read about that during the session. And I like to think of myself as an annoying news consumer who reads through this stuff. So then I think, well, what does the general public who votes, who cares about their state, but also has 2.5 kids, a lawn and rent and a mortgage to pay, how do they know about those things? I fear that maybe some good things are getting lost. Is that the case here?
Absolutely. And that's why, overall, it was a good session for things that we did for North Dakota. North Dakotans don't know what happened because we spent all this time and this oxygen talking about culture war bills. And, When I say that I feel like it was in the basement in terms of sessions, I know I'm speaking for a lot of North Dakotans of all ideologies. I'm getting emails still today of people just saying, thank you for putting up with the session. We can't believe that these are the priorities that North Dakotans are advancing. And as I said to my colleagues in my closing statement, none of us want to have these conversations. It's because a few handful of legislators who came with an extreme agenda have the privilege, just like I do, of introducing any legislation that they want, and every bill gets a hearing in North Dakota, which is great. But it took the oxygen out of the room and spent all this time on these conversations instead of talking about higher education more focused, or the child care crisis, or how do we make sure that we expand behavioral health west of Highway 83, which were all things that we came into session wanting to talk about. So I know, most North Dakotans, I think, woke up and would just shake their head when they read the headline or when they'd hear news stories on the radio through your guys' show or the nightly news of what's going on out there.
Well, I mean, I'm part of the media, right? So when people say, well, they're not hearing about these other things, I guess that's something people like me have to answer for to a point, except that we're human beings too. I can only write so many pieces a day, and it's hard to ignore book bans. Right? It's hard to ignore. We're gonna make it illegal to. We're gonna make pronouns illegal. We're gonna allow parents, snowflake parents, to sue their teacher if they teach their kids something they find offensive, which could literally be any subject from gay people exist in the world to the Holocaust. These are stupid bills, horrible, stupid bills, and so I can't ignore them. But there were good things that happened. Emily O'Brien, with massive bipartisan support, got through a very significant, very meaningful child care bill that I think it could potentially be one of the most consequential pieces of legislation passed this year. We got through tax relief, and I know everybody, has got different ideological feelings about that, but there was some very meaningful tax relief. Both in terms of the property tax, I'm glad we didn't do another property tax buy down, but the income tax. We could be talking about these things, but instead, the impression that we're left with, and I think a lot of people in the legislature would blame the media, folks like me, for focusing too much on the negative stuff, but there were good things that happened this session, but I don't think the blame for the public's perception of this legislative session lays anywhere other than the legislature.
Yeah. And my response was never about the media. You guys were telling the stories,
sure,
and,
right.
And we struggle the way it is to get enough news out of what's happening in Bismarck. It was so extreme, right? People just shook their head, and that's what we were discussing. And, I give credit to, former representative, majority leader, Al Carlson. I came in my first session, and he and I certainly didn't agree on much, if anything at all, but he had control of his caucus. He was a leader. He would say each session, you get one abortion bill. This year, he would have said, you get one transgender bill. You don't get 21. We shouldn't have 3 book ban bills going through the session. You get one. Because he knew the importance of, he had a story he wanted his caucus to be able to tell of whatever the priority issue of that session was for him in the GOP. We've lost that leadership, and some of that I give grace to the new leaders, and they're learning on the job. But I hope that they step up and start holding their members accountable in terms of the conversations and the focus that we have 80 days, and we burned through 80 of our 80 days, but really on the calendar it says 75 days, right? Because of the shell game we play.
The fake days. That's my new favorite colloquialism from this legislative session. Fake days.
Josh, you had a caucus of those 12 members, right, of the House?
Yeah. Correct.
So
12 of the House.
12 out of 94. I felt like, and I'm showing my extreme bias here, I felt like the Democrats this session punched well above their weight class as far as number of bills passed and significance of the kind of bills. Because let's be honest, there are some bills that are simply go local sports team, or a very minor but maybe necessary adjustment to language, updating it to read something that's more modern, or something that was simply incorrectly placed in previous sessions. I'm talking about substantial bills like workforce training ones. You had the child care bills that Emily O'Brien successfully passed through. Those were originally in the form of a Democratic bill at the beginning of the session, correct?
Correct. Yeah. Democratic bipartisan bills. Yep. They were led by Democrats, but you're exactly right, Ben. We feel, against all odds, we came in and we succeeded in getting serious, focused issues passed, but also worked with the majority to be part of the governing coalition. And we've always been a part of that governing coalition. And you and I were elected in 2012 together. There was 24 of us in the House, and there was a whole different moderation of the GOP too. So there was this ruling or governing coalition that got things done.
There were 9 pro-choice Republican House members at the time, like explicitly pro-choice.
Yeah, I don't even know I can't validate that number or anything, but there's a reason we have Medicaid expansion in this state. There's a reason that with a GOP-controlled legislature and a GOP governor, we've advanced behavioral health funding. There's a reason why we still fund K-12 education at the level that we do. And that's because there's been a ruling, I should say governing coalition of Democrats and Republicans who have gotten things done against some of the noise that has been made out in Bismarck.
All right. Well, from a conservative perspective, or, the right of center perspective, I always, in 20 years of covering the legislature, I always get a laugh when Democrats complain about Republicans stealing their bills, right? Republicans stole, and sometimes
you could just cut out the middleman, have the good idea right away if you wanted to.
Right. Sometimes it's chicanery where they take
7 of my bills right after I left.
Okay.
All I have to do is elect them, have them propose it, unelect them.
Stop complaining.
The Ben Hansen Grievous hour will run.
Okay. Well, there is some chicanery where if you just blatantly take the text out, put it in a Republican bill, and then kill the Democratic bill pass. Some of that's partisanship, and I think that's unfortunate. I would argue, though, that one of the reasons why the North Dakota Republican Party has been in charge for 3 decades is because of pragmatism, right? It wasn't ever this sort of glinty-eyed, 100%, lockstep ideology, right? Which I think is what a lot of the current Republican caucus now wants. It was pragmatism. It was a willingness to say, that's a good idea. We're going to pass it. That would serve North Dakota well, right? I felt like that was the priority, was let's serve North Dakota. And so I think, Josh, when you're talking about a governing coalition, I think what you're talking about, people who are organizing their service in the legislature around public service, as opposed to service to an ideology or service to whatever is going to get likes on Facebook.
Correct. Yeah, I agree. And, again, that when we even say service to North Dakota, it was service to their communities. It was making sure their schools stayed open and making sure their hospitals stayed open. And unfortunately, the fear that those members of that governing coalition have now is for lack of a better word, the pitchforks that are going to come out at their town hall meetings and their district conventions next spring, and being able to stand up to that. And that's where we need places like the chambers of commerce or local business leaders and education professionals in those communities to show up to those GOP events and support the people who supported them this session, so we don't have to have these conversations.
I'm marveling right now at the outgoing Democratic House Minority Leader encouraging people to show up at Republican district conventions, but really that's where we're at, because you're exactly right. I keep using the example of, on the Senate side, Jessica Bell, formerly Senator Jessica Unruh. She was a very consequential lawmaker, was very conservative, to your chagrin, perhaps, Josh and Ben. But she was a good lawmaker.
Had a guns, coal, and freedom paperweight on her desk.
Right. She was a conservative, and she was a good lawmaker, but she got unseated because she voted to sustain Governor Burgum's veto of the trans bill. And when I talked to lawmakers this session, they have told me privately, I have to vote for this because if I don't, they're going to censure me and they're going to push me out and they're going to replace me with somebody even more crazy, which I got to tell you, voting crazy so that you don't get replaced by somebody who's crazy seems like a good way to race to the bottom. But it's exactly to your point, Josh. The moderates got to start showing up in the GOP again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think holding those people that challenged the Jessica Bell Unruhs, or Unruh bill, accountable, right? The senator who ran against her campaigned exclusively on eliminating property taxes. That's what he was going to do. Well, he didn't even introduce a bill to do that.
He introduced two bills. He introduced 2 bills, Josh. One bill was some stolen election malarkey, and the other one was a book ban.
The bookman, yeah, but nothing on property taxes. So the reason she supposedly got unseated, right, beyond her one significant vote.
And by the way, that was Senator Keith Boehm. We're identifying the people we're talking about.
Yeah. So the beauty of term limits is hopefully Senator Bell raises her hand and comes back, and holds him accountable to what he has done and not done, and they she was a good representative for coal country, and there was a lot of things that she and I didn't agree on, but we're from the same age demographic. She had a young family. We talked about issues that were important to her community as it related to education and childcare.
And I think also, again, organizing your service around public service as opposed to some of the other stuff. And now how we define what's right for the public is going to differ based on our ideologies, but that's the point you're making. It comes back to that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Josh, what do you see for the future for the Democratic Party in the state? A question I know you've never been asked before and you've never thought about up until this very moment. You know very well the history of the Democratic Party in North Dakota and where it's at right now. Where are you seeing it, and what are you obviously your role or your goal will be to make gains for the party. Where do you see that happening? How do you see it happening?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I'll use the old model, right? We'll say we have the National Democratic Party tied around our necks, but we don't have to worry about that as much anymore because now we have a story to tell of what we accomplished this session, how we stood with the GOP, and really focusing on key districts. There are legislative districts where we will not win this next election or even the next 3 elections. However, the advantage that term limits provides us is that every theoretically 8 years, there will be open seats available. And so it's how do you help build relationships with people in those communities to build local trust so that they understand that, the North Dakota Democrats, the teacher who's running or the retired superintendent or the county commissioner who's running as a Democrat in their district isn't Nancy Pelosi or AOC or Bernie Sanders or Barack Obama. They are the person that you've trusted and have lived next door to every day and want to make sure that amidst the national conversation that's happening, we're putting North Dakota first. That's, I think, the biggest challenge we're going to see for Midwest states like us is, for instance, the Farm Bill. And now I'm talking about Congress, but this partisanship and the divide and the extremism that's happening is when we don't have a Colin Peterson driving the Democratic narrative on the Farm Bill. You now have where it's urban Democrats having a conversation about it versus those who live in the communities related to agriculture and the potential impacts that's going to have on rural America. And so I know that's kind of a broad swath that's being painted, but this is where we need to get back to where we have Republicans from urban communities, we have Democrats from rural communities, and we're building these coalitions again of moderation. We don't get anything done when we just go to the extremes and we fight, right? It comes to the people who come to the table and have ideas and willing to compromise and give and take is where we've seen some of the best public policy passed.
Because one of the problems is like District 33, since we were already using that as an example, Keith Boehm defeats Jessica Bell in the Republican primary, and then at that point the election's over because there was no Democratic candidates. So, I mean, that seems like even if you have a story to tell, you also have to have the candidates who are providing the alternative. So how do you get people? And again, you've never been asked this question before. How do you? I mean, does that story start with people being able to run for office? And is there also, maybe this is a better question, is there an opportunity to draw some people who have gone over to, who have been, going to Republican meetings or voting for Republicans to say, hey, maybe it's time for a Democrat?
Yeah. Well, I think first, all of us have short memories. And while this last election, 2022, we did not field candidates in a lot of races, that was somewhat intentional and a byproduct of the 3 cycles before that, running some of the best candidates we've done throughout North Dakota and not being able to get people across the finish line and people getting treated poorly in their communities because they put a D next to their name. And so, yes, we did not field candidates in a lot of legislative races.
54, I think, were left empty.
But we know we've learned from that, and we're hoping that there's new energy and that we are able to field candidates, because part of it is people have to be willing to put their name on the ballot. And maybe it's not as a Democrat. maybe it's as an independent. You look at what happened in District 24. Madeline Luke, who ran as an independent in a newly created District 24, which is Barnes and Ransom County right now, within 300 votes she got as an independent. So that meant Democrats, Republicans, and others were voting for somebody who didn't have a party label. And in some of these districts, maybe it's best if someone's not a Republican and not a Democrat, and try that experiment.
Oh, good.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, it could be. I'm a little, sometimes I'm worried about the independent thing as again, chicanery. I mean, at some point, I feel like partisan labels are useful in that you're trying to define somebody. I mean, it's said so, well, care about what the candidates say about the issues and everything. The problem is we're asked to vote on a lot of candidates from a bunch of statewide elections, county officials, city officials, and everything else. If independents, I think they still need to define themselves.
So what does voting for a Republican mean now then?
That's absolutely
John
fair.
Nelson or Keith Bain.
That's
absolutely
absolutely
and that's the
fair.
hard part is you're exactly right. When voters aren't able to be informed or aren't as informed as they should be, they vote by that letter.
Sure.
And that letter,
it's created a
problem.
problem.
There's a lot of people who voted for some of these people that didn't realize who they were voting for.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
Representative Boschee, what's the number one thing from this session, good or bad, that you don't think has gotten enough coverage or you'd like to highlight as being consequential? That, again, it's not as like I'm trying to throw, I don't know what, critiques of the media, but just like that, you want people to know that might be in the weeds, that's going to have a long-term consequence.
Yeah, so this is going to be self-serving. It's a bill I introduced, House Bill 1480. And what House Bill 1480 does is it's called pay for success. So it's this idea that we are starting to shift how we fund, specifically in education or Department of Corrections, and this is specific to Department of Health and Human Services. But we have to have outcomes, right? We can't just keep funding services. There are people in crisis and there's services we have to provide, but what Pay for Success does is it creates a new model in this little side program where we look at, okay, let's look at a program that's established. Let's find some new vendors. Let's get some investors up front who use private capital to fund the investment. And if they meet the outcomes, then we pay them back based on a contract. But if we don't meet the outcomes, if we don't increase literacy in a certain school district by 5% or whatever the outcome is, then the state or the local political subdivision doesn't have to write the check. The private investors are out the loss because they didn't find a way to find a solution for us. And it's been done for the last decade, and we'll be one of the states that actually has it in statute. But it's something that I've looked at for years, and a number of people both on the right and the left have advocated for. But it's, instead of us continuing to churn and funnel government in these programs, it's how do we start holding our partners, our service providers accountable? How do we make sure that we're getting outcomes for the dollars we're investing as a state? And so it's a small pilot project. We set aside $2.5 million and work with the Department of Health and Human Services looking at some programs to say, where can we get this delivered and find a new way to fund government.
Are there other states doing that currently?
There are other states that have funding models in place. Oklahoma, Indiana, New York is the most known because they did it with the Rikers prison system as the first project. Utah has done it in childcare, but we're a common space, and where we likely will go in North Dakota is home visitation programs with early childhood, birth or prenatal to 5 years old, helping parents be parents and learn how to take care of their kids, make sure kids are healthier, hopefully offsetting that pipeline of kids that don't learn well, then do poorly in school, who have behavior issues, who then end up part of the judicial system. Kind of that theory. But I'm excited about it because I introduced it, not, again, being the minority leader with this crazy new idea. Didn't think it would get legs, but there's a lot of curiosity this session. And as I said in my closing speech at Sine Die, a lot of the sacred cows got thrown out. So the House Appropriations Committee was more generous in a lot of bills than the Senate Appropriations Committee. And I think that allowed for some.
Jeff Delzer's having a heart attack.
He is. And we thought the ghost of Jeff Delzer would have been in that room, and I shouldn't say ghost because he's still alive, but his spirit or his philosophy. But people had independence, and I think there was a lot of people who felt that independence this session from previous sessions.
I think that's really interesting because one thing I think we kind of take I'm a believer in American exceptionalism, and I love my country. I argue, I think that's one thing that I've been kind of disgusted with Republicans. I will never love a politician as much as I love my country. But I digress. One thing that's alarmed me is you look at some national statistics like life expectancy in the United States. We're falling off a cliff. We are not healthy. And a lot of that has to do with like infant mortality rates in America are not good. And I think for so long we've taken, our prosperity and our economic might and everything else for granted. And there are real problems here. And I think we're so busy. That's one way I look at kind of the culture war stuff is it's kind of a product of how successful we've been, right? That we have so much wealth, we have so much time on our hands that we can get upset with one another over who's the spokesperson for a third-rate beer, right? This is stupid. Why are we spending our times on that? Who cares, right? And Budweiser cares. I mean, I'm not trying to diminish it. It's just like, why are we spending so much time? Well, because we have the time. But instead of focusing that time on how do we make our communities better, we're fighting with one another over this stupid stuff. I've been wanting to write something about it. Clearly, I have not worked through the best way to articulate it yet. But I feel like a bill like yours, which flew under the radar, I don't want to say addresses it because there's no silver bullets. But I mean, it's focused. Like, no, we have real problems in America. America has real problems that need to be solved that don't have anything to do with pronouns or beer spokespeople or whoever. It's. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Scary books in your library.
Or scary books in your library.
Yeah. Well, Rob, one of the pieces I really appreciated that you wrote this session, and there was a lot, it helped me set my frame around some of my legislative colleagues. The piece you wrote, I think it was about a month ago, about there's this generation of policymakers where all they know is the fight. They don't know that we're supposed to go there to find solutions and work towards things. It's about zingers and throwing bombs and likes on Facebook or retweets instead of seriously finding compromise and understanding that there is another party that we have to work with.
I was picking on kind of Trumpy young lawmakers, but I think it really goes across the aisle because I see a lot of people on the left here in North Dakota too who are just not necessarily in the legislature, but who are just so glib and just so shallow and just die. And it really bothers me because at the end of the day, we have to make real policy that matters. We have to serve the public.
There's a lack of a shared sense. There's sometimes it's more nostalgic than it's glossed over more than it was. But there is this nostalgia for that post-World War II America where there seemed to be a consensus around who the bad guy was in that specific foreign conflict and what success looked like for a middle class. And that didn't include as many people as it should have. But right now, I think what you're talking to, Rob, is both the young or extreme left and right don't really know what victory looks like, and they don't maybe try and strive for it. And that's Ben Hansen's commentary. We're here interviewing Josh Boschee. I'm clearly still new at this hosting thing, Josh. But Josh, what would you have to say to that as far as the caucus goes?
Ben would like you to rubber stamp what he just said, Josh.
Right, Josh?
Right. No, I think it comes back. I mean, I will go even deeper in the fact that because of our education system and the challenges there, we aren't able to focus on some of the curriculum, right? How much civics and what is being taught in civics is actually a part of a curriculum? Is it just a class in 10th grade and that's the only time we're instructing on civics? Versus what does it mean to be in a democracy, or what does voting look like? I mean, I always got frustrated. You all both know I ran for Secretary of State. I got frustrated when I hear these auditors talk about how they couldn't find people to help staff elections. I was like, well, why aren't you going to the high schools or the local college and getting kids who, in my theory, had time and would like to make $10 an hour to sit there and learn about the process, especially when we talk about the technology pieces now with, bring them in. Don't always think of the retirees that have done it. And now we make them work 18-hour shifts and they don't want to come back next time.
Huge problem in Cass County trying to recruit people right now for these 18 hours.
I've thought about going and volunteering myself. The problem is who wants to roll up to vote and see Rob Port sitting there and count your ballot, right? I'm probably the wrong person to be sitting there, but I think it's that. And also I think, Ben said, if we get a little philosophical about it, Ben said something that they don't know what victory looks like. And I think part of the problem too is they think like a permanent victory is possible. which it's not. You live in a democracy. Every part of our law can be changed. We can amend the First Amendment if we wanted to. I'm not saying we should. In fact, I would oppose that. But we could remove the First Amendment. We could get rid of it if we really wanted to.
I work for it every day.
Everything is malleable. There are no permanent victories. That's by design. But they go into every election like this is the election to end all elections. We'll finally have defeated, we'll have vanquished the other side and everything will go our way. And then when it doesn't, they get really, really angry and they think people cheated. And it's no, you just live in a democracy where you have to accept that there's going to be people who just don't want to live the way you want them to live and don't want to have the laws be what you want them to be. And you're going to have to make peace with that.
Yeah. And part of that is then after that election, how do you work with the people who won? You can make everyone a villain and fight, or it's like, all right, I'm because that's the thing, we'll call them Trumpy young Republicans, some of those colleagues that I work with in the legislature, but they still have things they want to accomplish.
Sure.
I just think they're distracted by the glitz and the glam and the things that are going to get them the likes instead of like, you can really make an impact. Like, what is something you care about?
You could never do it practically or First Amendment wise, whatever. It'd be fascinating to take away everyone's social media, every legislator's social media for 80 days every other year. Again, not a practical thing, not a thing you could do, but it'd be a fascinating social.
Well, I think it's a side effect too of putting cameras in the room, right? I mean, we've talked about the C-SPAN effect at the national levels. Now, I'm not arguing at all for taking the cameras out of the room. I like that the cameras are in there. They should be in there. But let's not pretend like they're not an inducement to performance sometimes.
Sure.
I don't feel like I saw a lot of performing in committees this session.
Not necessarily committees. They're still new in committees.
Did you think so, Josh? Did you think people were performing for the camera in committee?
No, I think most people forget there are cameras, and that's why you have a clip.
Good.
If you saw
Get them on film for next election.
Yeah. Let's the floor I think everybody knows is prime time, right? All right. Well, that's I don't know. Now that we've solved all the problems, Josh, and figured out how to make everything work better. It's an easy thing. I do agree with you though. I mean, we've really got to get back to basics in this country because we are down the rabbit hole on some of this other stuff. We've got to get back to serving the public well. And again, there were some very good bills that came out of this session. It's just unfortunate that, and I even think about like candidate recruitment, right? I mean, the way that some of these bills made, and I guess again, you can blame the media, but it's hard when you're trying to make it a crime to use certain pronouns. That's going to get talked about, and a lot of these bills made our state look like a backwater. And that's so unfortunate because there are so many wonderful, beautiful, smart, creative people who live in this state. And it's a wonderful place to live. Josh and I are both from Minot. We were having dinner, about a year ago now. And we're talking about what a magical
County
place.
Mafia.
Ward County Mafia. That's right. What a magical place like Summers and Minot were, right? I mean, because we both grew up here in the state fair. And I love this state. I love everything about it. And I wanted to be served better than it is and not portrayed the way it is nationally.
Representative Boschee, I led off asking you to rank the session. You've now served 4 sessions under Governor Burgum. Can you rank his performance or what his interaction was like with the legislature here? We're going to have him on the show next week.
Sure. Well, I guess I wouldn't necessarily give him a ranking. I do know he was much more engaged this session than previous, and that's something he's worked on. I give him credit. He didn't veto all the bills that I wish he would have vetoed. But when you look at across this country, and there's a lot of what we were calling trifectas, right? One party has both chambers and a governor. I believe and I'm saying believe by the fact that I haven't done the research on it, but I have to believe that he's one of the only Republican governors vetoing Republican bills. Right. The other vetoes we're seeing as Republican legislators in a Democratic governor or vice versa in those vetoes. So him willing to stand up against this overreach and this extremism at a time where many of us are wondering what his future political career is. He has been down to Iowa, and we know that he is a very aspirational person. So
we're gonna ask him about some of those things next week.
Yeah.
I've been waiting because when I wrote that first story about him being in Iowa, I was so excited. I wanted to get him on the podcast, and then Mike Nowatzki, his spokesman, was like, "No, not till after the session port." So the last day of the session, I'm texting Nowatzki. All right, how about that interview? Let's go.
Right? Get them, book them up. So so the governor's been a good partner, and I'm not just saying that politically. He has treated us fair, our caucus fair. We have had access to him. He has always supported the good ideas and stood against the bad ideas, whether they're ours or somebody else's. And so I've appreciated working with him. And I think one thing that I'm continuing to learn is he's not the politician I think we try to make him out to be, right? He is a CEO. He is a data-driven person. And so even learning about how he does his vetoes, I don't know if he's going to be willing to share that with you all, but the process, his process of that his staff and the amount of data and the amount, I truly think Governor Burgum is one of very few people who actually reads every bill. Not every legislator reads every bill, myself included.
Well, certainly at the end, there weren't a lot of people reading. In fact, I have a column up today about a little error that was made in the OMB budget, which could potentially call this legislature back to session to fix. I don't know what's going to happen on that.
You miss it yet, Josh? You want to go back like next week and like gavel in?
Well, I think there's a lot of people that got on a lot of planes and they need some time. So
well, that's and by the way, too, we've been talking about the governor wielding his vetoes. The number of vetoes he issued, not outside of historical norms at all. I know there was a lot of carping about it sometimes about the number of vetoes he was issuing, but I think it was probably because he was vetoing some pretty high-profile Republican bills at times, and that probably created the consternation more than.
Yeah, as we talked about, there was precedent for Governor Ed Schaefer's first session vetoed more than double, I think triple the number of bills that Governor Burgum did with a Republican legislature.
23 vetoed bills. Although it was a much more
before.
Although a Republican majority is a much more bipartisan legislative in 1993 than in 2023. But all right, with that, Josh, we'll let you go. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thanks. You guys keep up the good work and looking forward to tuning in and not having to be the topic of discussion for a while.
Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.